This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this analysis of a complex geopolitical question. What would a ground invasion of Iran actually require? Over the next few minutes, we'll examine the military, logistical, and strategic factors involved in such a hypothetical scenario. This isn't an advocacy piece, but rather an exploration of the immense challenges, costs, and considerations that would face any nation contemplating such action. We'll look at geography, force requirements, supply chains, and historical precedents to understand why this remains one of the most daunting military undertakings imaginable. Let's begin. Chapter 1. From where? When American military planners gathered in secure briefing rooms across the Pentagon in early March 2026, they confronted a problem that had haunted strategists for decades. Could the United States successfully invade and occupy Iran? The answer, emerging from those classified sessions, according to multiple defense officials who spoke to reporters on condition of anonymity, was sobering. Iran represents perhaps the most challenging ground invasion scenario the American military has faced since the Second World War. The country's sheer physical dimensions, combined with terrain that seems deliberately designed to thwart foreign armies, creates a military puzzle with no easy solution. But the deepest problem was simpler than terrain or force ratios. It was a question of basic geography. From where would American forces even enter the country? Iran sprawls across roughly 636,000 square miles, making it approximately 3.5 times the size of Iraq. When American forces rolled into Iraq in 2003, they faced a country of roughly 40 million people, spread across 169,000 square miles. Iran's population exceeds 90 million, concentrated in cities nestled among mountain ranges that have protected Persian civilizations for millennia. The scale difference alone transforms every aspect of military planning. What worked in Baghdad becomes irrelevant in Tehran. The logistics that sustained operations in Fallujah would collapse under the weight of Iran's vastness. The Zagros Mountains form a natural fortress along Iran's western flank, stretching 900 miles from northwest to southeast. These peaks rise above 14,000 feet in places, creating a barrier that has turned back invaders throughout history. The Alborz Range guards the north, running along the Caspian Sea coast with Mount Damavand towering at 18,000 feet. Between and beyond these mountain chains lie deserts that swallow armies whole. The Dasht-e-Kavir Salt Desert in the north and the Dasht-e-Lut in the southeast create landscapes so inhospitable that military operations become exercises in survival before they become combat. Former U.S. Central Command Commander General Joseph Votel, speaking to defense analysts in mid-March, described the challenge of reaching Iranian nuclear facilities. This would be going to a place like Natanz or Isfahan, probably one of those locations. Those are well inland, several hundred miles into Iran. You'd have to make sure you dedicated air power. You'd have to put combat air patrols up over the area. You'd have to have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in place. The arithmetic of invasion begins with understanding military force ratios. The popular 3-to-1 rule gets cited endlessly in television studios and congressional hearings, leading to absurd calculations. If Iran fields 81 combat brigades, the simplistic math suggests America would need 243 brigades to succeed. The entire United States military possesses only 70 brigade equivalents. This superficial analysis misunderstands the actual science of force planning. The 3-to-1 ratio emerged from tactical studies of local engagements, not strategic invasions. At the point of contact between attacking and defending units, the attacker historically needs roughly 3 times the combat power to overcome prepared defenses. But combat power measures capability, not just headcount. Training quality, equipment sophistication, air support, artillery, and logistics all factor into the equation. More importantly, at the operational and strategic level, force ratios compress dramatically. A properly planned invasion typically requires a ratio closer to 1.3 to 1. The calculation becomes more nuanced when comparing Iranian and American military units. Iran claims brigade strengths of 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers, but American intelligence analysts estimate actual manning at roughly 75% of American brigade combat team levels. The standard U.S. BCT fields 4,000 to 4,700 soldiers at over 95% strength. When factoring in divisional, corps, and Army-level support assets, the American military maintains a brigade slice of 15,400 personnel for every combat brigade. Iran's equivalent calculation yields 10,987 personnel per brigade. Before considering training, equipment, or operational effectiveness, an Iranian brigade represents roughly two-thirds the capability of its American counterpart. Applying the 1.3 to 1 operational ratio to Iran's 81 brigades, adjusted for their smaller effective size, suggests the United States would need approximately 70 combat brigades for a successful invasion. By remarkable coincidence, 70 represents the exact total of American combat brigades when counting the entire Army, National Guard, and Marine Corps. The problem becomes immediately apparent. America maintains global commitments across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. A strategic reserve must remain for homeland defense and unexpected contingencies. At minimum, one-third of American ground forces must stay outside the Iranian theater. The invasion would require at least 24 Allied brigades to reach adequate strength. Finding those Allied brigades presents its own challenge. America's most reliable military partner, the United Kingdom, would struggle to contribute more than 4 brigades. Other NATO allies, many of whom have already refused to support the Iran campaign, show little appetite for sending ground troops. The Gulf Arab states fear Iranian retaliation and public backlash. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have already suffered Iranian missile strikes for merely hosting American bases. The idea they would commit ground forces to an invasion stretches credibility beyond recognition. The comparison to South Korea illuminates an uncomfortable truth about American military structure. South Korea fields 76 combat brigades, nearly matching the American total. After adjusting for slightly smaller Korean units, their ground force equals approximately 67 U.S. brigade equivalents. South Korea achieves this with roughly half the uniformed personnel and just 6.6% of the American defense budget. The disparity exists because South Korea builds an army to defend against North Korea across a fixed border, while America maintains an expeditionary force capable of projecting power globally. The United States operates 222 C-17 Globemaster III heavy strategic airlift aircraft, 20 times more than the next-ranked nation. Each aircraft costs $340 million and burns $30,000 per flight hour. This massive airlift capacity enables America to deploy brigade-sized forces anywhere on Earth. But it also explains why the defense budget supports relatively fewer ground combat units than nations with purely defensive missions. France spends roughly the same as South Korea on defense, but fields only 16 combat brigades, because those brigades can deploy globally. America's expeditionary capability comes at the expense of raw infantry numbers. The composition of American ground forces reflects decades of focus on counterinsurgency and complex terrain operations. Light infantry units, including airborne, air assault, and standard infantry brigades, comprise 54% of U.S. combat power. These formations excel in mountains, jungles, and urban environments. They require less logistical support than mechanized units, consuming roughly half the supplies by weight, and can deploy by air. Armored and mechanized brigades represent only 36% of American combat strength. These heavy units dominated the Iraq invasion, racing across flat desert terrain to Baghdad. But against Iran's mountains and cities, the mixed force structure creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities. The 82nd Airborne Division represents the cutting edge of American rapid deployment capability. In early March, as the Iran war intensified, the division went on high alert and began reorganizing under new doctrinal concepts. The transformation from traditional infantry brigade combat teams to mobile brigade combat teams reflects hard lessons from Ukraine and simulated war games. Each MBCT contains approximately 1,900 personnel, less than half the 4,500 in a standard infantry brigade. This dramatic reduction in footprint makes the units faster to deploy, harder to detect, and more maneuverable in contested environments. The mobile brigades trade raw mass for increased reconnaissance and flexible firepower. Infantry squad vehicles replace some traditional troop carriers, enabling rapid repositioning across battlefields. Multifunctional reconnaissance companies at brigade level and multi-role companies within battalions deploy commercial small drones, electronic warfare systems, and anti-tank weapons. The 82nd's sudden cancellation of command post exercises in mid-March signaled that elements might deploy to the Middle East, potentially to seize Iranian airfields or ports in the war's opening stages. Yet even these elite formations could not solve the fundamental geographic problem. Iran shares land borders with Iraq, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. None appear willing to host an American invasion force. The Taliban government in Afghanistan would never permit American forces to transit their territory after 20 years of American occupation. Iraq hosts roughly 2,000 American troops in 2026, but asking Baghdad to support an invasion of its neighbor crosses from politically difficult to politically impossible. The Iraqi parliament has demanded American withdrawal multiple times, and Iraq's delicate sectarian politics make it an unreliable platform for operations against a Shia neighbor. Turkey, under any circumstances, would refuse. The border region between Turkey and Iran runs through rugged Kurdish areas where Ankara fights its own insurgency. President Erdogan has positioned Turkey as a broker between Iran and the West, not as an American launching pad. Even if Ankara agreed in principle, the geography defeats the concept. The Iran-Turkey border traverses the Armenian highlands and Zagros foothills, precisely the terrain most favorable to defenders. When reporters pressed President Trump on March 18th about potential ground operations, he replied, "No, I'm not putting troops anywhere. If I were, I certainly wouldn't tell you." The denial did nothing to quiet the speculation among military analysts who understood that airstrikes alone could not achieve the administration's stated objectives. CBS News reported in mid-March that the Pentagon had made detailed preparations for ground deployment, including plans for detaining Iranian soldiers and securing captured facilities. This geographic reality leaves only one viable option for introducing major ground forces: an amphibious assault from the sea. The United States maintains the world's premier amphibious warfare capability, but even this strength faces severe constraints when applied to Iran. An amphibious operation against defended coastline ranks among the most difficult military undertakings. Modern amphibious assault relies on the same basic physics as Normandy, but the weapons have evolved to make the enterprise even more perilous. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, deployed from Japan aboard USS Tripoli, USS San Diego, and USS New Orleans in mid-March, carries 2,200 Marines and sailors. 20 F-35B stealth fighters provide air cover, while MV-22 Osprey tilt rotors and attack helicopters give vertical assault capability. This represents a formidable force for raids or limited objectives. It remains grossly insufficient for contested amphibious invasion. The 2nd Marine Unit, sailing from San Diego aboard USS Boxer and 2 accompanying ships in late March, adds another 2,200 personnel. Combined, these forces could potentially conduct simultaneous landings at 2 locations, but each site would receive only battalion-strength assaults. For comparison, the 1991 liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation involved over 500,000 coalition troops. Iran's southern coastline along the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz stretches over 150 kilometers. Behind every potential landing beach rise mountains providing observation and firing positions. The closest American bases capable of supporting sustained operations sit in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. Both nations have already expressed profound discomfort with hosting strikes against Iran, and both have suffered retaliatory Iranian missile attacks. The distance from Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE to the Strait of Hormuz coastline exceeds 150 miles of open water. Every supply convoy, every casualty evacuation, every reinforcement would cross that water under potential attack. Harrison Mann, a former Defense Intelligence Agency targeting officer who resigned over the war, outlined 3 potential ground operation scenarios in an interview with national security reporters. The first involved seizing Iran's uranium stockpiles, over 200 kilograms enriched to 60% purity. You'd need to secure the facility, hold it long enough to remove the material, and extract safely, Mann explained. We're talking about operations deep inside Iran, probably at Isfahan or Natanz, with zero margin for error on the timeline. The second scenario targeted Karg Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. The island sits 15 miles offshore, making any occupying force exposed to shore-based missiles, drones, and fast boats. The third involved seizing key coastal positions to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which Mann assessed as theoretically possible but strategically pointless if you can't hold them indefinitely. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking at a press conference on March 16, appeared to endorse ground operations when he stated, "There has to be a ground component to ensure Iran's nuclear program is permanently dismantled. There are many possibilities for this ground component." His comments sparked immediate speculation about Israeli troops participating in an invasion, though Israeli military analysts privately dismissed the idea as politically impossible given the distances involved and Arab states' refusal to grant overflight rights. Rick Clay, a former intelligence operative with extensive Middle East experience, told reporters that any ground deployment would be limited. "We're not going to put troops on the mainland," Clay said. "The only troops you might see, if anything, would be to take out those 3 islands," referring to Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tunb Islands that Iran seized from the UAE in 1971 and controls the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. General Votel described the requirements for even a limited ground operation at a nuclear facility. "You'd have to bring in a security force, probably a brigade size, or 1,000 to 3,000 or 4,000 troops, just to secure while they did that work. You'd have to make sure you dedicated air power. You'd have to put combat air patrols up over the area. You'd have to have ISR in place. You'd have to logistically sustain them, and then be prepared to protect that tail. And then you have to have all of the lift, whether it's rotary wing or fixed wing, to get them in and get them all back out." The logistical tail Votel mentioned represents the hidden mass beneath every combat operation. For every soldier on the front line, somewhere between 4 and 10 others work to keep that soldier supplied, transported, communicated, and medically supported. A brigade of 4,000 fighters demands a support structure of 16,000 to 40,000 personnel, depending on the operational intensity and distance from established bases. Inside Iran, those supply lines would run through contested territory every mile. Retired Colonel Steve Ganyard, a Marine aviator and ABC News contributor, explained the vulnerability. "Normally, in an amphibious assault, you have all sorts of Navy landing craft behind you to sustain the force ashore. There's none of that logistical tail that would allow them to remain ashore. Without secure supply corridors, ground forces become isolated and fixated on survival rather than achieving objectives. The question military planners confront isn't whether American forces could land on Iranian soil. The Marines have rehearsed amphibious assault for 80 years, perfecting the craft in the Pacific during World War II, at Incheon in Korea, and in countless exercises since. American air power could suppress Iranian defenses long enough to get helicopters and Ospreys to landing zones. Special operations forces could seize key objectives in daring raids. The question is what happens next? How do you sustain operations inside a country the size of Alaska when your supply lines run across hundreds of miles of ocean and your nearest secure base sits in a nervous ally already targeted by Iranian missiles? How do you expand from isolated beachheads into control of cities, oil infrastructure, and nuclear facilities scattered across mountain ranges and deserts? How do you distinguish victory from simply having troops ashore?
The two Marine Expeditionary Units now sailing toward the Persian Gulf represent roughly 1% of the force that military mathematics suggests would be needed for invasion. They carry enough combat power to raid, to demonstrate presence, perhaps to seize a small island or evacuate civilians from an embassy. They cannot invade and occupy Iran. Yet they sail nonetheless, because the absence of a viable ground option does not eliminate the political and strategic pressures pushing toward escalation. Somewhere between the mathematics that shows invasion is impossible and the political logic that demands decisive action lies a space where bad decisions happen. As the ships cross the Indian Ocean toward their destinations, that space grows narrower and the margin for miscalculation thins toward zero.
Chapter 2. The Fortress Doctrine. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps traces its origins to the chaotic days following the 1979 revolution, when Ayatollah Khomeini needed a force loyal to the new regime rather than to the military traditions of the Shah. What began as ad hoc revolutionary committees and militia units evolved into a parallel military structure that by 2026 numbered approximately 190,000 active personnel. The IRGC answers directly to the supreme leader, not through the regular military chain of command. This organizational separation means the Guards maintain their own ground forces, Navy, Air Force, and intelligence services. They control the Basij, a volunteer paramilitary organization that claimed over 600,000 members before the current war began. Unlike conventional militaries that emphasize professional detachment and following orders regardless of political sentiment, the IRGC was deliberately constructed as an ideological force. Recruits undergo religious and political indoctrination alongside military training. Officers rise through ranks based partly on revolutionary commitment and partly on tactical competence. This ideological foundation makes the Guards fundamentally different from armies that collapsed when their leadership was killed or when initial battles went poorly. The bet that Supreme Leader Khamenei's assassination would shatter the command structure and trigger mass defections misunderstood how the IRGC actually functions. The force was built to survive exactly this kind of decapitation, with redundant command nodes and a culture that expects martyrdom rather than fears it.
The ground forces of the IRGC operate alongside but separately from Iran's regular army, where the Artesh, as the regular military is known, maintains conventional divisional and brigade structures focused on territorial defense and large-scale warfare. The IRGC ground forces emphasize mobility, special operations, and unconventional tactics. Iran's current defensive doctrine draws heavily on hard-won lessons from the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War, when invading Iraqi forces became mired in costly urban warfare despite initial tactical advantages. The mosaic strategy, as Iranian military planners call it, deliberately fragments the battlefield into countless small engagements rather than presenting conventional fronts where American firepower advantages would prove decisive. Decentralized command structures mean that local commanders don't wait for orders from Tehran to engage targets of opportunity. Small units of 10 to 50 fighters operate from prepared positions with caches of weapons, supplies, and communications equipment pre-positioned for extended operations. When American forces approach, these cells can attack, disperse, and reform elsewhere. The doctrine accepts trading space for time, pulling back from positions rather than defending them to annihilation, but making the enemy pay in blood for every kilometer advanced.
The IRGC's Navy, officially called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, numbers approximately 20,000 personnel concentrated around the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. This force bears little resemblance to traditional blue water navies built around destroyers and cruisers. Instead, it fields hundreds of small, fast attack boats armed with heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and anti-ship missiles. These boats, typically measuring under 20 meters in length, can reach speeds exceeding 50 knots. They hide among the thousands of commercial fishing vessels, dhows, and small craft that normally crowd the Gulf's waters. When scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, they become nearly impossible to target comprehensively from the air. The swarm tactic exercises Iranian naval forces have practiced for decades envision dozens or hundreds of these small boats converging on larger warships from multiple directions simultaneously. American and Allied naval vessels carry sophisticated anti-missile systems and rapid-fire cannons designed to engage aircraft and incoming rockets. These systems struggle against small surface contacts approaching at high speed from different vectors. A carrier strike group's defensive envelope can handle aircraft attacking from the sky and missiles coming over the horizon. Stopping 50 speedboats racing in from all compass points while distinguishing them from legitimate maritime traffic presents a fundamentally different problem.
Many submarines add another dimension to Iran's asymmetric naval threat. Iranian shipyards have produced more than 20 small submarines in the Ghadir class, displacing roughly 120 tons and carrying a crew of 18. These vessels can lay mines, launch torpedoes, and deliver special forces teams to beaches. Operating in the relatively shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, where depths rarely exceed 90 meters and often measure much less, the submarines become extremely difficult to track. Modern nuclear attack submarines and anti-submarine warfare aircraft designed to hunt Soviet ballistic missile submarines in the deep ocean find the Gulf's acoustic environment confusing. Thermal layers, heavy shipping traffic, and biological noise create a sonar picture where small diesel-electric submarines simply disappear. Naval mines represent perhaps the most feared element of Iran's maritime arsenal. The Islamic Republic possesses thousands of mines in various types, from simple contact mines that explode when struck to sophisticated influence mines that detect passing ships through magnetic signature, acoustic noise, or pressure changes. Mine laying can be accomplished by submarines, surface ships, or even commercial vessels that lower mines over the side at night. Once in place, mines create psychological terror disproportionate to their cost. A single mine might sink a billion-dollar warship or oil tanker. More commonly, the mere suspicion of mines paralyzes shipping. Mine clearance requires slow, painstaking work by specialized vessels dragging acoustic sleds or deploying unmanned underwater vehicles. The process measures in weeks or months for even limited areas.
Iran demonstrated its mining capability during the 1980s Iran-Iraq War when it mined Gulf waters, leading to the International Tanker War. The United States Navy struck Iranian oil platforms and destroyed Iranian naval vessels in 1988 during Operation Praying Mantis. But American officials at the time acknowledged that fully securing the Gulf from mines proved impossible, while Iran retained the capability to lay new ones. Fast forward to 2026, and American planners confront the same problem multiplied by 40 years of Iranian preparation. Intelligence assessments from March estimate Iran positioned pre-surveyed minefields that could be activated within hours and maintain the infrastructure to lay additional mines continuously. The drone revolution has transformed warfare globally over the past decade, but nowhere has it mattered more than in the Middle East. Iranian defense industries developed an extensive family of unmanned aerial vehicles ranging from small quadcopters to the Shahed 136 loitering munition that gained infamy in Ukraine. These one-way attack drones, which crash into targets carrying explosive warheads, cost perhaps $20,000 each to produce. They fly low and slow, making them difficult for sophisticated air defense radars optimized to track fast-moving jets.
Their small size means that shooting them down with missiles costing millions of dollars each generates an unsustainable cost exchange. What caught American forces by surprise when the war began was the scale and effectiveness of Iran's first-person view drones in tactical scenarios. These commercially derived quadcopters, often built from Chinese components and fitted with explosives, proved devastatingly effective in Ukraine's war. A Ukrainian operator can fly an FPV drone directly into a Russian tank's vulnerable top armor from several kilometers away. The technology requires only basic components and software available globally. Iran imported the concept wholesale, training hundreds of operators and stockpiling thousands of drones. American bases in Iraq, established over years and hardened against rocket and mortar attack, discovered their vulnerability to FPV drones in the war's first week. The drones flew directly into hardened shelters, equipment parks, and troop concentrations. Legacy air defense systems designed to intercept artillery shells and rockets proved useless. The small drones simply weren't in the threat library. Improvised countermeasures using electronic jamming had some effect, but Iranian operators adapted by using fiber optic control cables for the final approach, making their drones immune to jamming. 6 American servicemen died in drone strikes during March, a toll that would have been unthinkable before the era of tactical drones.
The United States has not developed the counter-drone capabilities that Ukraine refined through desperate necessity. Ukrainian forces deploying mobile teams with shotguns, anti-drone rifles firing electromagnetic pulses, and small interceptor drones designed specifically to ram incoming threats. These systems emerged from wartime innovation and rapid battlefield testing. The Pentagon's acquisition bureaucracy, designed for major weapons platforms requiring years of development, never prioritized the unglamorous work of stopping cheap drones. Israel possesses some counter-drone technology, but even their systems struggle with saturation attacks where dozens of drones arrive simultaneously from different directions. Iranian naval drones, or unmanned surface vehicles, add yet another layer to the threat matrix facing any amphibious force. These are essentially remote-controlled or autonomous speedboats packed with explosives, designed to ram into the hulls of larger ships. Saudi Arabian naval vessels and Emirati offshore installations have been attacked by Houthi naval drones over the past several years, with several successful strikes sinking or damaging multi-million-dollar patrol craft. The technology transfers easily from Yemen's Houthi allies to Iranian forces operating in the Persian Gulf. Detecting an explosive-laden boat among thousands of legitimate craft, then engaging it before it reaches its target, tests defensive systems to their limits.
Iran's missile forces represent a strategic capability that survives despite weeks of intensive American and Israeli bombardment. Intelligence estimates suggested before the war that Iran possessed between 2,000 and 3,000 ballistic missiles of various ranges. Many were fired in the war's opening exchanges, but mobile launchers dispersed across Iran's vast territory remain extraordinarily difficult to locate and destroy from the air. The missiles demonstrated their reach on March 19th, when an Iranian strike targeted Diego Garcia, the British-American military base in the Indian Ocean, located approximately 4,000 kilometers from Iran. This range significantly exceeded the 2,000-kilometer maximum that Western intelligence had previously assessed for Iranian missiles. The strike on Diego Garcia, while intercepted before causing damage, exposed a critical gap in threat assessments and raised questions about what other capabilities Iran had successfully hidden. Diego Garcia hosts B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, aerial refueling tankers, and serves as a critical logistics hub for operations across the Indian Ocean region. Iran sending missiles toward this target, regardless of their ultimate effectiveness, signaled both capability and intent that American planners had not adequately accounted for. If Iran can reach Diego Garcia, then every American facility from Qatar to the Mediterranean sits within range.
Beneath Iran's territory lies a parallel nation built over 4 decades specifically to survive the kind of air campaign now underway.
Hundreds of underground facilities house command centers, weapons depots, missile production lines, drone assembly plants, and fuel storage. The construction program accelerated after American airstrikes in Iraq and Libya demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of precision-guided munitions against surface targets. Iranian engineers studied those campaigns and concluded that anything above ground would be destroyed in the opening hours of any future war. The solution was to dig. The scale of this underground infrastructure staggers comprehension. The Natanz nuclear enrichment facility, struck repeatedly during the June 2025 air campaign and again in March 2026, was built beneath meters of concrete and earth specifically to resist aerial attack. Satellite imagery after the March strikes showed crater damage to surface buildings and tunnel entrances, but the deep halls where centrifuges once spun remained largely intact. The Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center stores Iran's most sensitive nuclear material, including over 200 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity in tunnel complexes that were deliberately collapsed and filled with rubble when American attacks began. This wasn't damage, but rather Iranian engineers sealing the storage vaults, making the uranium effectively irretrievable from the air. The Pickaxe Mountain facility, also known as Natanz Deep Underground, represents perhaps the most formidable hardened structure Iran has constructed. Intelligence assessments suggest this installation was carved into solid rock hundreds of meters below the surface, possibly beyond the penetration capability of even the most advanced American bunker buster weapons. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the largest bunker buster in the American arsenal, weighs 30,000 pounds and can penetrate 60 meters of concrete or 200 meters of earth. If Pickaxe Mountain's halls lie deeper than that, or if the overlying rock provides greater protection than simple earth, then no air-delivered weapon can reach it. American production of advanced bunker busters never reached mass quantities precisely because these weapons target a narrow slice of potential objectives. Open source reporting suggests the United States manufactured perhaps 60 to 80 GBU-57s total since the program began. Each costs roughly $15 million and requires a B-2 stealth bomber to carry and deliver it. Against the hundreds of hardened sites Iran has prepared, the math becomes impossible. Even if every bunker buster in inventory scores a direct hit on a critical target, the majority of Iranian underground facilities would survive untouched.
The same dynamic that transformed historical invasions into quagmires threatens American ground forces today. Polling data shows that Iranian citizens, including those with no love for the Islamic Republic's government, have rallied against foreign attack. Opposition figures who might have welcomed American support for regime change instead condemn the bombing of their country. Nationalistic sentiment, always powerful in Persian culture with its multi-thousand-year history, overwhelms political divisions when foreign armies threaten. The hope that Iranians would rise up and overthrow their government once American forces landed ignored both Iran's modern history and basic human psychology. Iran's air defense network, while severely degraded by weeks of American and Israeli strikes, has not been entirely eliminated. Surface-to-air missile batteries using Russian S-300 systems and Iranian domestic designs still protect key facilities. More importantly, the sheer geographic scale of Iran means that air defenses need not create a total umbrella to be effective. They only need to threaten approaching aircraft enough to force those aircraft to operate at higher altitudes, reducing the accuracy of strikes, or to follow predictable routes that can be ambushed. The loss of several American aircraft, including at least one F-35 stealth fighter that suffered damage requiring an emergency landing, proves that Iranian air defenses retain some capability. The integration of drones into air defense creates a new challenge for attacking aircraft. Traditional surface-to-air missiles target aircraft based on radar returns and heat signatures. A drone costs perhaps 1,000th as much as a jet fighter. Trading missiles for drones bankrupts the defender, but a different tactic emerges. Iranian forces can fill airspace with small drones that physically threaten aircraft.
A quadcopter weighing 5 kilograms will destroy a $50 million F-35 if it gets ingested into an engine intake or smashes through a cockpit canopy. Pilots must either avoid areas saturated with drones or fly high enough that drones cannot reach them, which reduces their effectiveness against ground targets. The combination of all these defensive systems, IRGC ground forces, naval swarms, mines, ballistic missiles, drones, and underground facilities, creates what military theorists call defense in depth. No single system proves decisive, but together they generate multiple independent chances to inflict casualties and delay or defeat enemy operations. An American amphibious assault might succeed in getting Marines ashore despite naval mines and swarm boat attacks. Those Marines might establish a beachhead despite drone strikes and missile attacks. They might even advance inland despite IRGC resistance. But sustaining that force, resupplying it, reinforcing it, and expanding the operation requires repeating the same gauntlet daily for weeks or months. Each element of Iran's defensive system was specifically designed to counter American strengths. The United States dominates in conventional air and naval combat, in communications and intelligence networks, in precision-guided munitions. Iran cannot match those capabilities and does not try. Instead, Iranian planning focuses on asymmetric responses that exploit American vulnerabilities. Small boats swarm because the U.S. Navy optimized for anti-air warfare. Drones saturate defenses because American doctrine assumed high-technology solutions to high-technology threats. Mines close waterways because clearing them requires time and specialized equipment that cannot be rushed. Underground facilities survive because building deeper proves easier than bombing deeper. After 3 weeks of airstrikes that destroyed much of Iran's conventional military capability, the defensive systems designed for exactly this scenario remained largely intact and ready to receive their first ground visitors. The question was no longer whether Iran could be bombed into submission. That possibility had passed. But whether American forces would test whether the fortress could be breached from within.
Chapter 3. The Verdict of the People. The Quinnipiac University poll released on March 9, 2026, contained a number that should have stopped the conversation about ground troops immediately. 74% of registered American voters opposed sending troops into Iran. Only 20% supported the idea. This was not a narrow margin subject to interpretation or statistical noise. This was a democratic mandate of the kind that appears rarely in modern American politics, where the country fractures along partisan lines on nearly every issue. On the question of American soldiers dying on Iranian soil, the public had reached a verdict with unusual clarity and force. The poll's internals revealed fractures even within the Republican base that had carried Donald Trump to the presidency. Among Republican voters, only 37% supported deploying ground troops. This meant that nearly 2/3 of Trump's own party opposed the signature escalation that military logic suggested would be necessary to achieve the administration's stated objectives. The numbers among independents and Democrats approached unanimity against invasion, with opposition reaching 80% and 90% respectively. No modern American president had launched a major ground war with public support this week at the outset. What made the opposition more remarkable was its consistency across different polling organizations using different methodologies. ACN survey conducted during the same period found 60% of Americans opposed to deployment, with only 12% in favor. The gap between support and opposition measured 48 percentage points. Data for Progress, polling during the same window, discovered that 68% of voters opposed boots on the ground, while only 26% supported the deployment. Then came the most devastating finding. Reuters and Ipsos, polling between March 17th and March 19th, discovered that only 7% of American voters backed a large-scale ground invasion of Iran. 7%! That number fell within the margin that statisticians called the lizard man constant, the small percentage of respondents who will endorse any proposition no matter how absurd, either through inattention or deliberate mischief.
Support for invading Iran had effectively reached zero, statistically indistinguishable from the baseline noise present in all polling data. This was not opposition. This was rejection so complete that the question itself became almost meaningless. Yet the same Reuters Ipsos poll uncovered an even more ominous finding for the administration. While only 7% supported an invasion, 65% of Americans believed Trump would order exactly that operation anyway. The public had concluded that their opposition would not matter, that the war's logic would overwhelm democratic accountability, and that they would wake up one morning to news that thousands of Marines were fighting and dying in mountains and cities most Americans could not locate on a map.
Inside the coalition that had powered Trump's political rise, the war triggered a rebellion that grew more vocal as March progressed. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia congresswoman who had been among Trump's most reliably fierce defenders, broke decisively with the administration on the Iran campaign. "The Iran war is rapidly spiraling out of control. It should have never happened," she wrote on social media on March 19th. Her criticism began the day the war started, when she declared that the attack on Iran was not what we campaigned for. The phrase captured the sense of betrayal rippling through the MAGA movement. Trump had promised no new wars, no endless Middle East entanglements, no more American blood spent on foreign soil for unclear objectives. Operation Epic Fury violated every one of those promises. Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist and one of the most influential voices in the MAGA coalition, called the Marine deployment a major escalation and warned that it sends a signal to Iran, but it also sends a signal to the American people. Coming from Bannon, whose nationalist credentials were beyond question in Trump's base, the criticism carried particular weight. This was not establishment Republican hand-wringing or Democratic opposition. This was the revolution eating its own. Joe Kent's resignation struck harder because Kent was not a peripheral figure or opportunistic critic. He had served as the head of the National Counterterrorism Center in Trump's administration, overseeing the government's efforts against terrorist threats globally. Kent resigned on March 17th with a letter that leaked to media within hours. "I cannot in good conscience support this war," he wrote. The letter alleged that Trump had started this war due to pressure from Israel and claimed that there was no intelligence that said Iran posed an imminent threat to the United States before the start of hostilities. Kent expanded on his objections in an interview with Tucker Carlson 2 days after resigning. There was no intelligence that said, hey, on whatever day it was, March 1st, the Iranians are going to launch this big sneak attack. They're going to do some kind of a 9/11, Pearl Harbor, etc. They're going to attack one of our bases, Kent explained. His message struck at the administration's core justification for the war. If Iran posed no imminent threat, if no attack was being planned, then the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei and everything that followed represented not preemption but aggression. The resignation of a senior intelligence official on grounds of conscience during an active shooting war had no recent precedent. Officials resign over policy disagreements during peacetime. They stay in their posts during conflicts, suppressing their doubts in the name of institutional continuity and national unity. Kent's departure signaled that the internal opposition to the war ran deep enough that at least some officials preferred public resignation to quiet complicity.
Democratic senators shut out of the decision-making process that led to the war and denied any meaningful vote on its authorization, channeled mounting fury after classified briefings that revealed the absence of any coherent plan. Richard Blumenthal, the Connecticut Democrat who sat on the Armed Services Committee, emerged from a closed-door Iran briefing on March 4th visibly angry. "I emerge from this briefing as dissatisfied and angry, frankly, as I have from any past briefing in my 15 years, Blumenthal told reporters gathered outside the secure facility. He had spent those 15 years sitting through briefings on Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and counterterrorism operations globally.
For this briefing to rank as the worst suggested a catastrophic failure of strategic communication. I am most concerned about the threat to American lives of potentially deploying our sons and daughters on the ground in Iraq, Blumenthal continued, then corrected himself. In Iran, we seem to be on a path toward deploying American troops on the ground in Iran to accomplish any of the potential objectives here. His misstatement captured the confusion pervading Washington. The wars blurred together. Iraq, Iran, the broader Middle East became an undifferentiated zone of American military intervention without clear boundaries or purposes.
Chris Murphy, another Democratic senator from Connecticut who also attended the briefing, was more pointed in his criticism. Officials claimed the goal of the war was to destroy Iran's military assets, but they could not detail any long-term plan, Murphy wrote in a post the following day. The absence of a plan became a recurring theme. The administration could explain what it intended to destroy: missile launchers, naval vessels, command centers, nuclear facilities. It could not explain what would rise in their place, how Iran would be governed after the regime's collapse, who would control the country's oil fields and nuclear material, or what prevented the vacuum from being filled by forces even more hostile to American interests. Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts senator and former presidential candidate, spoke in language that bypassed diplomatic courtesy. I cannot overstate what a disastrous decision it would be for President Trump to order American boots on the ground in this illegal war and send U.S. troops to fight and die in Iran, she declared in a statement released March 20th. The word illegal carried specific weight. Warren and her Democratic colleagues maintained that the war violated the Constitution's requirement that Congress authorize military conflicts. Trump had launched the operation under his Article II powers as commander-in-chief, claiming that he was responding to Iranian threats and protecting American forces. Democrats argued that assassinating a foreign leader and destroying that country's military in a campaign that had already stretched beyond 2 weeks clearly constituted war, and war required congressional approval. The War Powers Act, passed in 1973 over President Nixon's veto in the aftermath of Vietnam, theoretically constrained presidential war-making. It allowed the president to conduct military operations for 60 days without congressional authorization, after which he must either receive approval or withdraw forces. Trump's 60-day clock would not expire until late April. Democrats introduced multiple resolutions attempting to force a vote on authorization or to cut off funding, but Republicans, who controlled the Senate, blocked every attempt. The votes demonstrated that while individual Republicans harbored doubts, the party leadership stood behind the president during wartime. This created the strange spectacle of a war with strong partisan support but weak popular backing. Republican senators and representatives voted with the administration even as their constituents expressed opposition. The disconnect worked temporarily because the war had not yet produced mass American casualties and because Republican voters, while skeptical of ground troops, broadly supported punishing Iran. The Reuters Ipsos poll found 77% of Republicans supported the air campaign. But support for airstrikes and opposition to ground invasion can coexist only so long. If military logic demanded boots on the ground, as Pentagon planners increasingly suggested it did, then the Republican coalition would face a crisis.
The public's understanding of the war's objectives deteriorated rather than clarified as March progressed. A CBS News and YouGov poll conducted between March 17th and March 20th asked whether the Trump administration had clearly explained the goals of attacking Iran. 68% of respondents said no. That number represented an increase of 6 percentage points from when the same question was asked in early March, shortly after the war began. Americans were more confused about why their country was fighting after 2.5 weeks of combat than they had been at the start. An NBC News poll found that 54% of Americans disapproved of Trump's handling of the conflict, a number that would only grow if the war dragged on without clear progress toward any discernible objective. Trump himself contributed to the confusion with contradictory statements sometimes delivered hours apart. On March 21st, he posted on Truth Social that the United States was getting very close to meeting our objectives as we consider winding down our great military efforts in the Middle East. The post detailed 5 objectives, including degrading Iranian missiles, destroying defense infrastructure, eliminating naval and air forces, preventing nuclear capability, and protecting regional allies. He concluded that the Strait of Hormuz will have to be guarded and policed as necessary by other nations who use it. The United States does not.
12 hours later, Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum demanding Iran fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face the obliteration of its power plants. The juxtaposition of winding down with threats to escalate into attacks on civilian infrastructure that would plunge Iranian cities into darkness suggested a president receiving conflicting advice and unable to settle on a consistent course. Financial markets, already reeling from oil price spikes above $110 per barrel, sold off further on the uncertainty. If the American president could not decide whether he was ending the war or expanding it, how could investors price risk? The economic dimension of public opposition added material weight to ideological objections. Gas prices in the United States climbed to $3.98 per gallon on average nationally by March 23rd, up from the mid-$2 range before the war. A Quinnipiac poll found that 74% of Americans feared the war would drive oil and gas prices higher. For working-class voters, many of whom had supported Trump on promises to improve their economic conditions, the spike in fuel costs hit directly. Every commute to work cost more. Grocery prices rose as transportation expenses increased. Heating bills climbed. The abstract question of Middle East policy became concrete in household budgets stretched thinner each week.
The war's direct fiscal cost compounded the economic anxiety. Lawmakers familiar with Pentagon budgets told reporters that the campaign was burning through $1 to $2 billion daily. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth requested an additional $200 billion in supplemental funding from Congress to sustain operations. $200 billion would exceed the annual defense budgets of every country except the United States and China. It approached the total cost of the Iraq War's first 3 years. And that figure covered only military operations, not the broader economic damage from disrupted oil supplies, not the eventual cost of reconstruction if regime change succeeded, not the long-term expense of occupying Iranian territory. 71% of respondents in the Quinnipiac poll believed the war would last months or longer. This public pessimism contradicted Trump's repeated assurances that victory was imminent and complete. The public skepticism reflected institutional memory of Iraq and Afghanistan's prolonged quagmires.
Harrison Mann, a former Defense Intelligence Agency targeting officer who had resigned over the Gaza conflict, offered a detailed analysis of why ground operations in Iran risked becoming a prelude to forever war. Mann argued that the same dynamics that trapped American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan for 2 decades would repeat themselves in Iran, only on a larger scale. The initial objectives seem clear: neutralize the nuclear program, destroy the IRGC, maybe decapitate the regime, Mann explained in an interview. But what happens on day 90, day 180? You're occupying facilities deep inside a hostile country of 90 million people, maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of contested territory. And the political objective keeps shifting because the original goals prove insufficient once you're committed. Trump's approval rating, measured across multiple polls, held at roughly 40% in late March. This represented a modest decline from the 43% he enjoyed before the war began, though still within normal variation. The stability of his approval, despite launching a major military operation, suggested that the air campaign had not significantly moved public opinion in either direction. Americans accepted the strikes on Iran as a fait accompli without necessarily endorsing the decision. But approval ratings measure past performance. The question of ground troops looked forward, asking Americans to endorse an action not yet taken.
On that question, the verdict was clear and negative.
The disconnect between elite decision-making and public preferences had characterized American foreign policy for decades, but rarely so starkly. The Pentagon was deploying thousands of Marines to the Persian Gulf region. Military commanders were drafting plans for amphibious assaults and airfield seizures. Intelligence agencies were mapping Iranian underground facilities. Defense contractors were rushing interceptor missiles and artillery shells to the theater. All of this machinery ground forward, while polls showed 3/4 of Americans opposed to the operation those preparations would enable. The mechanics of American governance allowed this disconnect to persist because the Constitution grants the president enormous latitude in conducting military operations, especially during the 60-day war powers window. Public opinion constrained presidential action through the threat of electoral consequences and congressional intervention, but both mechanisms operated on delayed timelines. Elections would not occur for months or years. Congress could theoretically cut funding, but doing so during active combat risked accusations of betraying troops in the field. Trump, assured of Republican support in Congress and apparently unconcerned about poll numbers, faced few immediate obstacles to ordering a ground invasion despite public opposition.
The soldiers and Marines being positioned for potential deployment had not been asked their opinion. Some number of them surely opposed the war on the same grounds as the 74% of their fellow citizens. They would go anyway because military service means surrendering the right to pick your wars. The volunteer military insulated civilian society from the direct costs of foreign policy decisions. In previous eras, when conscription made war a widely shared burden, public opposition translated more readily into political constraints. The modern volunteer force, comprised largely of working-class recruits from regions and communities with limited political influence, could be deployed without triggering the mass resistance that conscription might spark. Yet even volunteer soldiers have families, and those families vote. The photograph of a flag-draped coffin returning from Iran would carry political weight regardless of whether the deceased volunteered for service. The first memorial services, the first grieving parents appearing on television, the first small-town newspaper obituaries detailing lives cut short would test whether public opposition remained theoretical or hardened into active resistance. Between the crushing verdict delivered by the polls and the inexorable movement of military forces toward Iranian shores, the space for political reversal narrowed by the hour.
Chapter 4. When Ambition Met Reality. On September 22, 1980, Saddam Hussein stood in Iraq's presidential palace, confident that his army would deliver a swift and decisive victory over Iran. Iraqi intelligence had assured him that the revolutionary government in Tehran was weak, disorganized, and isolated. The Shah's military officers had been purged or executed. The armed forces were in disarray. Ethnic Arabs in Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province would welcome Iraqi troops as liberators from Persian domination. The invasion, Saddam believed, would take weeks, perhaps a month or two at most. Iraq would seize the Shatt al-Arab waterway, annex Khuzestan's oil fields, and establish itself as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. 8 years later, after more than 1 million dead and no territory permanently gained by either side, Iraq and Iran signed a ceasefire that restored the pre-war border. Saddam's quick war became the longest conventional conflict of the 20th century after the two world wars. The Iraqi invasion began with airstrikes against 10 Iranian airfields, a deliberate imitation of Israel's devastating opening move in the 1967 Six-Day War. Iraqi pilots flew low over the desert at dawn, hoping to catch Iran's air force on the ground and destroy it before the planes could launch. The raids damaged runways and destroyed some aircraft, but the Iranian Air Force survived largely intact. Iranian commanders, aware that revolutionary purges had weakened their readiness, had dispersed aircraft and hardened shelters. Within hours, Iranian F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats were striking back at Iraqi oil facilities and military bases. The air superiority Saddam counted on never materialized.
Iraqi ground forces crossed the border in 6 divisions along a front stretching over 400 miles. The 7th Mechanized and 4th Infantry Divisions attacked Iranian border posts at Fakeh and Bostan, opening routes for the main armored thrusts deeper into Iranian territory. 4 divisions drove into Khuzestan, targeting the strategic cities of Khorramshahr, Abadan, Ahvaz, and Dezful. 2 divisions secured the central and northern sections of the border to prevent Iranian counterattacks. Initial progress seemed to validate Saddam's optimism. Iranian border forces, thinly spread and poorly coordinated, fell back. Iraqi columns advanced miles into Iran on the first day. Then the advance slowed, and the character of the war changed. Iranian resistance stiffened with each kilometer the Iraqis penetrated. The Revolutionary Guards, dismissed by Iraqi intelligence as untrained fanatics, proved willing to die in place rather than retreat. They used recoilless rifles, RPGs, and Molotov cocktails against Iraqi armor. Iranian engineers flooded fields and marshes around key positions, forcing Iraqi tanks into narrow causeways where they became targets. Iraqi armor attacked without infantry support, a doctrinal failure that cost dozens of tanks to Iranian anti-tank teams firing from concealed positions. The battle for Khorramshahr became the defining engagement of the invasion's first phase. The city sat at the confluence of the Karun River and the Shat al-Arab waterway, making it strategically vital for controlling access to the Persian Gulf. Iraqi forces approached in a crescent formation, planning to encircle and capture the city quickly. What followed was 6 weeks of urban combat that turned streets into killing zones and buildings into fortresses. Iraqi troops would clear a block in the morning only to find Revolutionary Guards had infiltrated back into those same positions by nightfall. Snipers made every street crossing potentially fatal. Iranian defenders used the city's knowledge to their advantage, moving through buildings and alleyways that confused Iraqi units accustomed to fighting in open desert. One Iraqi tank commander, interviewed years later, described advancing through Khorramshahr as entering hell itself. His column entered a neighborhood on October 15th, expecting to link up with infantry that was supposed to have cleared the area. Instead, RPG teams opened fire from windows and rooftops. 3 tanks exploded in less than a minute. The surviving crews abandoned their vehicles and retreated on foot. By the time Iraqi forces finally controlled most of Khorramshahr in early November, 7,000 soldiers from each side had died. The Iraqis held ruins rather than a functioning city, and their offensive had lost its momentum. Iran's asymmetric response revealed everything Saddam had miscalculated. On November 28, 1980, Iranian forces launched Operation Morvarid, Pearl, a coordinated naval and air attack that destroyed 80% of Iraq's navy in a single day. Using American-supplied P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft and F-4 Phantom fighters alongside naval vessels, Iran demonstrated that military competence survived revolutionary chaos. The operation not only crippled Iraq's naval capability, but signaled Iran's willingness to strike beyond the land battlefield. Iraqi ships burning in port and sinking in the Gulf sent a message that the war would not follow Baghdad's script. The expected Arab uprising in Khuzestan never happened. Iranian Arabs fought for Iran, not for Iraq. Their sense of Iranian national identity stronger than ethnic solidarity with Baghdad. The political chaos in Tehran did not prevent military resistance. Instead, the foreign invasion rallied Iranians around the revolutionary government regardless of their private opinions about clerical rule. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. By November 1980, Iran had mobilized 200,000 fresh troops to the front, many of them ideologically committed young men eager to defend the revolution. On December 7, 1980, Iraq announced it would shift to a defensive posture along the entire front. This admission, coming less than 3 months after an invasion launched with promises of swift victory, marked the clear failure point. Saddam's forces would hold what they had seized, but would not advance further. The war that was supposed to last weeks had already failed in its fundamental objective.
Yet it would grind on for 8 more years as both sides launched increasingly desperate offensives that gained yards at the cost of thousands of lives. The relevance to a potential 2026 American invasion could not be escaped. Iraq in 1980 enjoyed massive advantages that the United States would not possess. Iraqi forces operated from interior lines, with their bases and supply depots mere miles from the front. They shared a language with the population they expected would welcome them, spoke dialects of Arabic close enough to communicate with Khuzastav's Arab minority. They faced an Iranian military that had just undergone revolutionary purges and had no combat experience as a unit. Despite all these advantages, Iraq failed catastrophically because the fundamental assumption that Iranians would not fight for their country under revolutionary leadership proved false. If Iraq, with a 400-mile shared land border and logistical bases in immediate proximity, could not conquer Iran, how would American forces operating from ships hundreds of miles offshore and bases in nervous Gulf allies succeed? The question had no satisfactory answer. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 offered a different but equally chilling parallel. The operation began with a British naval attempt to force the Dardanelles Strait and threaten Constantinople, capital of the Ottoman Empire. British and French warships entered the strait in February and March 1915, attempting to destroy Ottoman forts and clear the minefields blocking passage. Turkish gunners and mines sank or severely damaged multiple Allied capital ships. By mid-March, the naval assault had failed, demonstrating that sea power alone could not force the strait. This failure led to the decision to land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula to capture the high ground overlooking the strait and silence the Turkish guns. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian forces landed at several beaches along the peninsula. The Ottomans had prepared defensive positions on the ridges and hills rising from the shoreline. Turkish machine gunners had pre-registered fields of fire covering every likely landing beach. As Allied troops waded ashore from landing boats, they walked into interlocking fire zones that turned the surf red with blood. At Cape Helles, British forces encountered barbed wire strung beneath the water and trenches cut into the cliffs above the beaches. Troops who made it ashore found themselves pinned down by fire from positions they could not see and could not effectively return fire against. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, known as the Anzacs, landed at what became Anzac Cove. They were supposed to land at a broader beach a mile south, but currents and navigation errors brought them to a narrow cove backed by steep cliffs. Turkish forces occupied the heights above, firing down at the troops struggling up narrow ravines and steep slopes. Despite taking heavy casualties, the Anzacs managed to secure a tenuous foothold. That foothold never expanded beyond a perimeter a few hundred yards deep. The campaign settled into trench warfare as static and deadly as the Western Front. The Allies attempted a second landing at Suvla Bay in August, hoping to outflank the Turkish positions. The landing succeeded in getting troops ashore, but confused orders and timid leadership allowed the Turks to rush reinforcements to the area before the Allies advanced inland. By December 1915, the Allied leadership recognized that the Gallipoli campaign had failed. The campaign cost roughly 250,000 casualties on each side, including over 50,000 dead. Britain gained nothing except the bitter knowledge that Ottoman soldiers fighting on their own ground for their own homeland would not collapse under foreign attack.
The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, analyzing a potential Strait of Hormuz operation in early March 2026, described it as Gallipoli times 10, with the difference that the Iranians could always pull back to interior lines of defense. The comparison cut deeper than superficial similarity. Both operations would attempt to force a strategic waterway by landing troops under fire on defended beaches. Both would face defenders fighting from high ground with interior lines of communication and supply. The critical difference was scale. The Gallipoli Peninsula stretches roughly 50 kilometers from tip to tip, narrow enough that Allied naval guns could support troops across much of the battlefield.
Iran's Persian Gulf coastline extends over 150 kilometers along the strait alone, 3 times Gallipoli's length, backed by mountains that would put most Iranian positions beyond naval gunfire range and provide defensive depth impossible at Gallipoli. The Pentagon's Millennium Challenge 2002 wargame, conducted 24 years before the current crisis, revealed catastrophic vulnerabilities in amphibious assault doctrine that remained unaddressed in 2026. The exercise pitted American forces against a defending force led by retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper, playing the role of a Middle Eastern adversary closely resembling Iran. The wargame began with an American invasion fleet approaching hostile shores. Van Riper's Red Team used small boats, aircraft, and unconventional tactics to sink 16 American warships in the simulation's opening days, including an aircraft carrier. He employed swarm tactics with hundreds of small craft, exactly the capability Iran had spent decades developing. He used motorcycle messengers to avoid American signals intelligence, launched cruise missiles from commercial vessels, and positioned mines in strategic choke points.
The simulation's controllers halted the exercise and restarted it with new rules that prevented Van Riper from using his most effective tactics. Small boats were restricted. The Red Team could not shoot down American aircraft or target invasion ships without permission. The exercise continued under these constraints, producing an American victory that Van Riper later denounced as scripted. His public criticism sparked controversy about whether the Pentagon was genuinely testing its plans or simply validating predetermined conclusions. The fundamental vulnerabilities he exposed, carrier battle groups' susceptibility to swarm attacks, the difficulty of clearing mines in confined waters, the effectiveness of asymmetric tactics against conventional superiority, remained relevant in 2026. Iran had observed Millennium Challenge and incorporated its lessons into their defensive doctrine, while American planners appeared to have learned nothing except how to prevent embarrassing simulation results. The Vietnam comparison operated on a different level entirely. American forces in Vietnam never lost a major battle. Search and destroy operations killed enemy fighters at ratios that would have destroyed any conventional army. Yet the war was lost, first in American public opinion, and ultimately on the ground when North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon in 1975, 2 years after the last American combat troops withdrew.
The mechanism of failure in Vietnam was political rather than tactical. North Vietnam sustained casualties that would have broken most militaries. Estimates suggest that more than 1 million Vietnamese communist fighters died during the war, compared to roughly 58,000 American dead. But North Vietnam possessed strategic depth, external support from China and the Soviet Union, and a political leadership committed to victory regardless of the cost. The American government possessed none of these advantages. It fought a limited war, constrained by fear of Chinese intervention, domestic political opposition, and unclear objectives that shifted between defending South Vietnam, defeating North Vietnam, and containing communism in Southeast Asia. Iranian officials invoking Vietnam understood the comparison's psychological power. They did not need to match American tactical performance. They needed only to persist, to make the war expensive enough in American lives and money that the political will to continue would break. The American military in 2026, unlike in the 1960s, was all volunteer, which removed the galvanizing effect of conscription on domestic opposition. But it also meant the force was smaller and could not sustain prolonged high-casualty operations without breaking. The historical parallels converged on several common themes. Defenders fighting on their own territory enjoyed advantages that transcended force ratios and technology. National populations rallied against foreign invasion even when they opposed their own governments. Wars that began with clear, limited objectives tended to expand into open-ended commitments once the costs of withdrawal came to exceed the costs of continuing. Amphibious assaults into defended terrain produced casualties in ratios that modern democracies found difficult to sustain. Urban combat in Middle Eastern cities consumed armies without producing decisive results, as American forces learned in Fallujah, Ramadi, and Mosul during the Iraq War. Each historical case also contained differences that complicated direct comparison. Iraq in 1980 was a regional power punching at a neighbor of similar size, not a superpower projecting force across oceans. Gallipoli occurred during a total war where governments commanded national economies and conscripted millions of men, making casualties on a scale unthinkable in 2026 politically acceptable to publics in 1915. Vietnam was fought under the shadow of nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union, constraining American escalation in ways that might not apply to a conventional war with Iran.
Yet the 2026 scenario contained elements more dangerous than any historical precedent. Modern American technological advantages over Iran exceeded what Iraq possessed in 1980 or what Britain wielded at Gallipoli. But Iran's 40 years of preparation for exactly this invasion far exceeded Iraq's weeks, the Ottomans' months, or Vietnam's progressive escalation. The Vietnam War unfolded over a decade. The Iraq invasion of Iran lasted 8 years. Both sides had time to adapt, to learn, to shift strategies. Iran in March 2026 had spent 4 decades building underground cities, stockpiling missiles, training militia forces, and studying every American military operation since Desert Storm. They were not improvising resistance. They were executing a plan. The most critical difference separating 2026 from historical parallels remained unspoken in most analysis, but impossible to ignore. Nuclear weapons did not exist at Gallipoli. They were not used in Vietnam, despite their availability. They were not in Iraq's arsenal in 1980. But they existed now, in a region where Israel possessed them, where Pakistan bordered Iran, where the entire purpose of the American campaign was preventing Iran from building them. The specter of nuclear escalation, whether through Iranian acquisition of weapons from allies or Israeli strikes triggering wider war, hung over every decision about ground troops in ways unprecedented in prior invasions.
Somewhere between the mathematics that showed invasion was impossible and the political logic that demanded decisive action, American Marines sailed toward the Persian Gulf while military planners studied beaches and argued over landing zones. The question was not whether history's lessons were clear, they were crystalline. The question was whether they would be heeded, or whether this generation would learn them again, at a cost measured in thousands of lives and decades of consequence.
The mathematics are unforgiving. 70 combat brigades would be needed. America possesses exactly 70 and cannot commit them all. The geography offers no friendly entry point. The Iranian fortress, built over 40 years specifically for this scenario, remains largely intact despite weeks of bombardment. And 74% of Americans have delivered their verdict. No, history speaks with unusual clarity. Iraq's 8-year quagmire. Gallipoli's blood-soaked beaches. Vietnam's demonstration that tactical dominance means nothing without political sustainability. The 2002 Millennium Challenge wargame where simulated American carriers burned under swarm attacks. Every precedent points in the same direction. Yet the ships still sail, the plans still circulate, and 65% of Americans believe the invasion will happen regardless of their opposition. Between the impossibility that military science reveals and the momentum that political logic generates, the space for rational decision-making narrows by the hour. Whether this generation learns from history or repeats it remains the most consequential question of 2026. Thank you for listening.